Hello and welcome everyone to our 10th Energy versus Climate webinar and the last one of what we're calling Season 1. My name is Ed Whittingham and I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts David Keith and Sara Hastings-Simon from here in Alberta. I'm going to start with just a short story. In 2002, when I was still a wet behind the ears conservationist, I was invited to appear as a witness before the Government of Canada's committee looking at amendments to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. It was my first committee appearance ever. I was nervous about it. And luckily for me, I was seated just to the right of a giant of Canada's environmental community, the then executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada, Elizabeth May. And being seated beside Elizabeth had two specific advantages. One, when it came to questions of the legal minutiae of the act, I would say on matters of a legal nature, I'll defer to my colleague to my right, given Elizabeth's training as a lawyer. Two, I had a front row seat to watch her eviscerate the Chrétien government over its decision to sell CANDU nuclear reactors to China without conducting an environmental assessment, as had been required under the act until the Chrétien cabinet conveniently deleted that clause in a special cabinet meeting. So with that as a bookend, here I am close to 20 years later, not literally sitting next to Elizabeth, but doing the virtual equivalent and once again talking about nuclear power. So today on Energy versus Climate, we framed the discussion as nuclear power, our only solution to reach net zero, or a threat to civilization and abstraction from other low carbon pathways. Our guest, Elizabeth May, really doesn't need much introduction for this audience. So allow me to be brief to save time for discussion. She is, of course, the former leader of the Green Party of Canada, the current MP for Saanich Gulf Islands, the former head of the Sierra Club of Canada, an author of 8 books, and one of the leading environmentalists globally. So very special welcome to Elizabeth May.
Thanks very much, Ed. And it's good to be here with you and with David and Sara and the whole gang. And I'm just scrolling through 136 participants who've joined us. And I see some friends online and a lot of people I haven't met yet. So this is really going to be fun.
I think it's going to be fun. Well, thanks for joining us, Elizabeth. The usual webinar housekeeping reminders: send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Please don't use the raise hand or the chat function. You can always upvote someone else's question. And we've got our associate, Mika McFarlane, who's going to screen for live questioners when we get to the Q&A a little past, half past the hour. And as always, we're recording this for the podcast and for YouTube. So if you want to ask a question, it's your chance to be part of history. So let's, Mika, launch the pre-poll. And as we are fond of doing here on Energy versus Climate, we are actually going to start with a bit of a primer on nuclear power. And that is going to be led by David. And at the same time, he's going to outline his perspective on nuclear power's applicability to low carbon futures everywhere. So David, over to you. And once you're done, we'll check back in on the poll results.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Let me start by saying some of the obvious negatives. So nuclear power is deeply stuck around the world with absurdly high costs, deep structural problems in the industry. At a highest level, the challenges with nuclear power are waste, cost, weapons proliferation, and reactor risk. But I want to start by giving what I think are the fundamental reason to take it seriously as part of the way the world transitions to low carbon power. And to me, that really comes down to issues of the land footprint of our energy system, because so many other aspects of energy system are tied ultimately to land footprint. And my argument basically is there are only 2 things that humanity is really going to do at large scale to decarbonize, and it's solar or nuclear. It could be that we do it with all solar and no nuclear, but it's really important to be clear-eyed about the limitations of other things and their scale of environmental impacts. So lots of different ways to think about this, but if you look at estimates, and there are lots of estimates that are done by pretty reasonable, unbiased folks about the full life cycle power densities, that's the amount of power you get out per unit area, which is the opposite of the amount of area it takes to generate some power. Nuclear is order of sort of 50 to 100 watts per square meter. Wind, this is work I've done a lot of, including some data set where we looked at the entire US turbine by turbine data set. Wind is about in the US 0.6. And it's likely to get worse, not better. That's if you count at a project basis. If you count at a direct basis, it's a lot higher, and we can talk about that. Solar, we've also done looked at the entire US, and we looked at some Canadian data. The Canadian average, I don't know, but it's probably around 2 watts per square meter. So something of order 50 times worse than nuclear. And hydro varies a lot. So site C is actually relatively good on a power density basis at about 6, but average is under 1. And what that means is that if we're really serious about decarbonizing, we have to think about what this means. It's different in a place like Canada, which is very low population density, large land, but I'd like to keep more of that land for nature and not take it over with things not take it over with industrial activity. And it's important to say this isn't just some kind of starry-eyed idea about how we should care about preserving land from nature, though I would defend that. It's the fact that many of the environmental impacts flow from land disturbance. That's impacts on water, ecosystem impacts, mobilization of metals, et cetera. So to me, that's the central reason to take it seriously. Now let me say a little bit about costs and about the current status of the industry and then close. So for costs, I think the fundamental thing to say is that current nuclear costs are by any measure very high. In the developed world, there are only a few reactors under construction now not the developed world, in Europe or North America, and their costs are all spiraling to well over $10,000 per kilowatt installed, which is by many measures a very, very high cost. And even in China, where there are a fair number of reactors under construction, costs are hard to know because they're pretty secretive, but they seem to be, for the recent AP1000 reactors, probably heading towards $5,000 a kW. We don't really know. I think the important thing to say is that costs were not always high, and that there's been this kind of extraordinary social unlearning. This is data from Jonathan Koomey, who I think is a very unbiased guy who's done very careful, reasonable analysis. He went through the entire US reactor data set, looked at, and these numbers are public, so we know pretty well what the costs were, put them all into current dollars, and between 2004 and now is only 26% inflation. So basically this is current dollars. And you can see that the early chunk of the reactor fleet, we really did build in current dollars at under $2,000 a kilowatt. And if we could do that now, this would be a very cheap kind of power. Whereas some of the last reactors are very expensive. And I think the answer, when people say, what is the cost of nuclear power? The answer is, we don't know. It depends on a bunch of social choices about how we set up the nuclear industry. The current nuclear industry, I think, is untrustworthy and clearly cannot deliver reactors at reasonable prices, but it's not clear that can't change, and it's not clear that it's not different elsewhere in the world. If you look at individual contracts, like the Korean contracts into UAE, they've actually gone in at complete turnkey contracts of around $4,000 a kW. So it's really important to kind of think through what we mean when we think through the total costs. And then last, I just want to have a slide that says, one last slide about the current status of nuclear power. So the big reality of nuclear power is there's a huge build out in the 70s into the early 80s, depends where in the world. And then basically very little new reactor construction. If you look at total nuclear output, the all-time peak is 2006. This year will probably be bigger. So this year will probably be the biggest year for nuclear output, but basically it's been flat with the big reduction from reactor closures after Fukushima, and then a gradual climb out. My sort of bottom line view is that simply looking at immediate past history, it's very hard to argue that nuclear is a fast pathway or sensible pathway to low carbon power. But if you look on a longer time scale and say, how are we really going to decarbonize industrial societies all the way towards zero? I think you have to think seriously about nuclear power because it has such a low environmental footprint by so many measures. Thanks.
Thanks, David. So Elizabeth, we want to bring you into the conversation right away. So you have been on the record raising concerns about nuclear power. And if I understand your concerns correctly, you've raised concerns about readiness.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of, can we get it in a way that's meaningful to address climate change? But then also really about opportunity cost. $1 invested in nuclear takes away $1 we could be investing in other low carbon sources of power like solar and wind.
Yeah, no, and this is a very good dispassionate way to start the conversation, and I really appreciate David's slides. I'd be curious to push on some questions, like in terms of the footprint of nuclear. Are we including uranium mining
Yes.
in that? Okay.
Yes, and
'Cause
very generously, I would say. I picked. You can get much higher numbers. That includes
I'd
mining,
wonder,
reprocessing, disposal. Yep.
and I would also have put geothermal down as a renewable opportunity that I think has real potential and doesn't have a huge footprint. As a matter of fact, yeah. Well, and if you look at the stats we have for the abandoned oil wells that are already in Alberta and Saskatchewan, there's lots of them, that about 10%, and I'd love your thoughts on this too, but the data that we have is that about 10% of them have adequate heat at depth that you could convert abandoned oil wells into geothermal electricity production. And that is taking a toxic liability off the books of the governments provincially and turning it into green electricity. But let's go to the questions around nuclear that you were trying to get me to focus on here, Ed. I think, I would go back and say, number one, that when we look at waste, cost, and weapon proliferation, I agree with you. The costs issue, a high cost issue, is a big part of it, Dave. But we can't ever really say that we completely ignore the downside risks of a Fukushima, of a nuclear accident. They can never be completely eliminated, and human error is generally going to, create a risk of accident in technologies that otherwise have everything thought through, right? So 3 Mile Island and human error and all those kinds of questions. But because the climate crisis is so overwhelmingly significant, I mean, there is a link to nuclear here. We go back to the 1988 conference on which was Canada hosted the first global conference on climate science, and the opening statement, which links the issues, interesting enough, is humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences are second only to global nuclear war. So that was a way of framing the fact that the climate, well, at that point, 1988, it was a future threat. Now we're living in it, and it's just, and we're by every single month that goes by, I am mourning the chances that we're losing. We had chances in the all through the 1990s, all through the first decades of this century, where we procrastinated as a global society, and it really does reduce the runway we've got to get to good solutions to avoid the existential crisis of the climate emergency, which is second only to global nuclear war. So given that, we went back, this was when I was at Sierra Club, what's our position on nuclear, working it through with membership, do we need to rethink it? And we couldn't find, if you got down to where there was no way to get to a decarbonized electricity grid without nuclear, you better look at it. I don't, from everything we've got in terms of data back then and now, and the work that I've done since with Green Party, there's not to say that every member of the Green Party agrees with the policy which our members have passed, that there isn't a role for any new nuclear in a climate solution. And that's based on, look how fast things are happening that I wouldn't have even believed. I didn't think that I would see in my lifetime that the price of solar was cheaper than coal, that we began to see solar take such an important place, that we saw through pandemic, with the International Energy Agency stats, the only energy source and only energy investment that actually grew through COVID. I mean, as fossil fuel investments were plummeting, renewable investments actually managed to climb into the positive and be a growth area in pandemic, which one can assume, I think safely, please, that we actually have a post-pandemic future, that the renewable investments are just going to take off. So that the cost issue it's hugely in favor of going with renewables. Nuclear has a lot of problems, and I would say, in addition to the ones that David has mentioned, it also represents a certain model of electricity distribution, which is centralized, monolithic, transmission lines and so on. There's an opportunity here in moving away from, basically once you install renewable energy capacity, the marginal cost of energy is zero. You're not buying more fuel to continue to produce solar energy, for example. You don't buy the wind to run the wind turbines. So it changes the model of our utilities. Nuclear operates on the old model, monolithic, monopolistic, and does not democratize energy. So the nuclear installations, and this was a study out of Germany quite a while ago, but said basically that nuclear gets in the way because structurally it wants the old model. Now, the way we analyze this within the Green Party is this: any investments, particularly public investments of funds, needs to have pass a certain same metrics for every investment. And if nuclear succeeds, then nuclear succeeds. But the cost, first question is, per dollar invested, how many tons of greenhouse gases are avoided? For a dollar invested, how many jobs are created? For a dollar invested, what's the distance between when you invest that dollar and you get the returns? On that analysis, you're just going to be every single time way better putting your money into energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then, of course, even at this point, recognizing some of the recent studies on the importance of sequestration from tree planting comes out better. Now, if you're making an edit, that's investment of public dollars analysis. If you're doing the energy investment, can we decarbonize our electricity grid in Canada 100% without any new nuclear? Yes, we can. Can we decarbonize our electricity grid 100% with no new mega dams? Yes, we can. So I'm looking at that, and that's why I mentioned geothermal. Yes, solar. Yes, wind. A suite of measures and eco-efficiency. And we're going to need to look at fuel switching. This isn't an issue particularly affecting the reactors, but they'll be getting rid of the internal combustion engine. We will be using more electricity, but we will have some uses for the internal, for instance, farm equipment and fishing boats. There's a number of areas where we're going to look at fuel switching. Nuclear doesn't help us there, but we do have usable technologies. I think I've probably used up my time for my introductory response. Thanks, Ed.
No, Elizabeth, that was great. There's lots there. So I'm sure David's going to want to jump in, but next I want to go to Sara. So Sara, perhaps, and want to hear your perspective, and also this notion of existing nuclear versus new nuclear, and weigh in as well about this notion of opportunity cost as well versus investing in renewables. So over to you.
Yeah, I think I would have. There's so much to react to there. So I'll pick out a couple of things. I think the first on the issue of new versus existing. There I think it's pretty clear that we need all hands on deck on the fight against climate change, and so we cannot afford to pull zero carbon power sources offline. And from a pre-chat, I think I know that we sort of all agree on that point, and I think that's actually really interesting to see that kind of agreement. And that's not necessarily the case, obviously, globally, for a lot of different reasons in other countries. But, the idea that we would move away from existing nuclear that's producing power at zero or low carbon, I think it's just frankly crazy. The question then of, what else do we do? What do we put in next? I think the comparison and David's point around the land use, it sounds like we're going to have a future show about wind to dig in a bit further on some of the offshore numbers. And because I noticed the land use piece of the calculation. And of course, offshore wind is something that's growing quite dramatically in just, the past, it's not even decade, but like months, you could say. So I think that, there's other options. And there's also a question of, since there are so many different things that we can do in addition, if it's not a matter of kind of this global central planning of, these sources or those sources, I think there's other elements that come into that, I guess is what I would say. On the, things like geothermal, which, I can't pass up noting that, of course, geothermal is, in some form nuclear, because a lot of the energy that we have underneath the earth is actually coming from nuclear reactions that are happening down there. So there's your little random physicist tidbit that you can be for nuclear power in the form of geothermal. But beyond that, I think the thing for me that makes it hard to see a lot of investment going into building new nuclear is really just that issue of the time that we have and the alternatives available to get to net zero. this issue of the social unlearning and the rising costs, part of that really is an increased understanding of the different ways that nuclear power plants could fail, and increased safety measures that are taken. And so I'm not particularly worried about, the Fukushima type disaster, because, the number of lives that are lost every year to air pollution from, coal and natural gas, vastly outweighs that, right? But I think that the idea that that we could get those costs back down again, certainly within, the next 30 years, I think it's hard to imagine that, given where they come from, which is not just that we've sort of forgotten how to build them, but we're actually, adding layers, and in some ways making things more expensive while we're making the alternatives cheaper. And so, I think if I switch maybe just one sort of last comment on this idea of, there's a really interesting, I think, political and sort of social debate around why, nuclear power, why portions of government or government, types of philosophies are much more willing to support the idea of, what I would call industrial policy, and, pouring vast amounts of public money into certain technologies versus others. Can we redirect that and actually use that as a starting point to have a conversation of, what we should be spending on? And then I think the last thing that, I find sometimes challenging is that there are some within the nuclear industry, and not everybody, and there's some noted examples that are being, I think, more active now in this space, but there has been a lot in the past of sort of this framing of the fight of nuclear versus renewables. And I think that there's been a lot of, really unfair points that have been made by some, to try to kind of get nuclear to the front of the line ahead of things like wind and solar. And I think that's also quite problematic, and something that, sort of delays the transition overall. So I'll stop there. Lots more to talk about, I'm sure.
Thanks. Forgive me for just saying, I just want to put a bookmark around getting back to something that I skipped over, which I shouldn't, which is that as long as we're keeping nuclear power going, we have issues of nuclear proliferation and military applications. So I just don't want to get that lost as one of those things we should probably talk about.
I really want to get there. We've clearly hit a interesting and passionate topic, because I look at the clock, we're 22 minutes in, we've kind of done opening comments, which is a first on energy versus climate, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Can I come in?
And just so one thing that's relatively out of scope from our discussion is, we're not going to do a deep dive into the safety issues. If you're to look at, and maybe a terrible metrics, but deaths per gigawatt hour of production, I think we'd say that nuclear is pretty low. Although I say, being married to a Japanese woman and having Japanese in-laws around Fukushima, even if you say that ultimately the impact on human health was quite low. I remember my brother-in-law, who is normally this unflappable Japanese man, saying it caused social disruption in a way that in his 55 years then he had never experienced before. It really shook Japan and Japanese to its core, unlike I think other power sources can. But I want to get to poll results. Okay. I see David say, all right, poll results, David, we're going to agree on first principles. We'll talk about a few things, Q&A, and our hour will be up blindingly fast. So poll results, you had a quick look. 44% see nuclear playing a large role. 48% of you see a small role. 9%, the minority, seeing a nuclear power playing no role in Canada's pathway to net zero. Okay, David, you're the first to have your hand up. So you go ahead, and then let's get to some first principles we agree on.
Two things. So first of all, since both you and Elizabeth did raise issues of safety, I want to try and really be clear about what the kind of safety risks are. So Elizabeth said, there will always be accidents. Totally agree. But it's important to be realistic about what the consequences of those accidents were. The most exposed 2 workers at Fukushima got about half a sievert dose each. What does that mean? That means about a 1% increase in your 30-year cancer risk. Okay? That's about like a diet change. And I think it's important to be realistic. So Ed was saying, well, maybe it's low compared to others. No, it's very low compared to others. If you do realistic life cycle for solar, given the metals, it would almost certainly be higher. There was a refinery fire in Tokyo caused by that same tsunami. And that refinery fire likely caused more direct fatalities from air pollution than Fuki. So of course you're right about social disruption, but social disruption comes from fear. And the fear isn't based on actual human impacts. It's based on fear linked to the very realistic fear of nuclear weapons. But I think it's important to say that actual real safety for humans also matters. And it's our job as scientists to say something about what the real risks and trade-offs are.
Well, I think we need.
Okay.
I would dispute that we know for sure what the total impact of Fukushima, which I didn't look at before going to this call, but I certainly know that the distribution of highly toxic radionuclides in the marine environment had impacts. The impact on human health, I will go dig it out, but I know that after 3 Mile Island, there were big disputes over how much cancer was created. Dr. John Goffman wrote a book detailing how many people died after 3 Mile Island from cancers, and there were people on the other side saying no one died from 3 Mile Island. So I would just flag that as an area of dispute.
I guess so, but then maybe climate's an area of dispute too. I mean, let's be honest. I think the core science, I mean, yeah, then we can go in the Exxon camp, but that I'd say it's very easy to measure radiation. The instruments are cheap, much cheaper than for measuring lots of lead and toxics. And we have really good correlation over a long time.
So what I would say is the dispute is about how dangerous I will totally agree with you that we can measure the radiation. The dispute is on the side of how damaging is ionizing radiation to the human being. And that's an area where it's not like climate dispute. It's not like there's a settled science and a bunch of nuts. There is a debate among responsible, sensible scientists, and some of them, the late Dr. Rosalie Bertell, who was Canadian, was did a lot of research. She came out of the Manhattan Project, but her view was that we were absolutely taking chances because we didn't understand how dangerous ionizing radiation is. But I take your point, David. I would never say that we don't have the ability to measure how much nuclear material leaks from a reactor.
But because we have the ability to measure, we can do the correlation. So I mean, let's park it. But I would say actually, it really is a case where there's an enormous amount of high quality consensus science that says something about what the risks are from ionizing radiation. And we really know it much better than risks from lots of other things. Let me go on to costs. Okay. You just said that the renewables were all cheaper. I don't think that's true. So the fact is the current reactors being built in North America at Vogtle, which are super expensive and like double in cost, are still coming in. Finished costs are going to be about 11, 12 or something thousand bucks a kW. If you actually were building solar with backup now in Canada for real dispatchable power, you'd be higher. So I think it's just important to think through. I think there's no question that in the near term, for the next move on the chessboard, solar and wind is cheaper than anything because we're using the rest of the electric power system as backup. But if we're serious about actually decarbonizing the whole energy system, which we have to be if we care about climate, then we have to say, what is the next move on the chessboard? We can't just count the hydro or fossil as free backup. And if you're talking dispatchable with seasonal storage, as you have to in Canada, especially given the cycle for solar, I don't think it's actually fair to say that it's cheaper as of now.
Well, we wouldn't be, I don't think, now that's an interesting point, and I'm happy to talk about it, and I'm sure we're going to run out of time, but we're not talking about dispatch. We use, if we need the backup in the way that we're advocating for Mission Possible is that we need a very strong, robust, resilient national electricity grid. We need the ability to sell between and among provinces. We need to actually build up our interties. The government's moving in that direction now. So the investments that we need to have a really good, coherent climate plan, post-carbon economy is a lot of investments in electrical grid infrastructure and making sure we can certainly store. Pumped storage is perfectly good. It's a good way to deal with, and between Denmark and Norway, it works really well.
Well, it's not perfectly good. This is flooding land and destroying the environment.
No. It's there are enough empty quarries. There are enough existing reservoirs that pumped storage is a very good option. And interestingly enough, a lot of those empty quarry spaces are on Indigenous lands. So there's a reason that a lot of the most investments in renewables in Canada in the last number of years have been on Indigenous lands and controlled by Indigenous people.
Okay.
Without flooding any new land.
Let's agree on the next, what isn't going to be the next chess move. I think we all agree, well, first, we need more electricity, that as we move to net zero, that we're going to double or triple we need to double or triple the amount of electricity we have now. And I think no one here, including myself, is talking about taking existing nuclear offline. So we're not talking about not moving OPG, not moving ahead with refurbishment of the remaining 3 reactors at Darlington, for example. I just want to look around the Zoom window, and I think we're all in agreement there. Okay, then let's talk about what is being proposed for Canada right now, because there's the 2 to 3 gigawatt nuke plant that we could talk about. As far as I can see, the only discussions right now, serious discussions or serious contemplations in Canada, is at the SMR level. And SMR, I know small is going to be a bit of a misnomer, because in this case, small modular reactor can be up to 300 megawatts. And the advantage to that is you can produce high quality heat. It can work as a bridge fuel between fuel and power sectors, and you can right size different applications. It sounds great on paper, and gosh knows we've chopped down a lot of trees in the past 2 decades talking about SMRs. But do you agree that's where the conversation is, and how viable are SMRs in the Canadian context?
Who do you want to go first?
Sarah,
I don't think any. I think we're going to agree it's not a good idea.
Well, let's see. I might disagree, but Sarah, let's get you in, please.
Okay, so SMRs, I think, again here, David actually put an interesting place to it of sort of like, are we talking about the next chess move, or are we talking about the last chess move, right? So if the next chess move is what are we going to build next, we're not going to build an SMR next because they aren't ready to be built, right? And even the sort of projects that are the most advanced are seeing some delays happening now. And so then the question becomes, do we, need SMRs to reach a fully decarbonized power grid, or can we reach it instead with some combination of transmission lines, batteries, hydrogen, all these other things? I come down on the side of, I think it's very unlikely that SMRs are going to be the key answer to that question. They are, when you come back to the nuclear waste and the proliferation issues, they are worse than large reactors on that count, because you're basically, you're losing efficiency, so you're generating more waste in order to make these things work. And so, should we not invest anything in their development? No, I think we should keep our options open with a suite of technologies that we're moving forwards. But I think that amount of money that's going in there needs to be far exceeded by the amount that we're putting into deployment of the technologies we have for our electricity grid today, and for development of technologies that are nearer term to be ready to be deployed. Like, batteries and of sort of longer duration, some of this heat storage and things like that. So, I think, but I would keep it, in the back pocket as an option, for the future, sure. But I think it's being much oversold by many who are saying, it's the only answer.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, go ahead.
I want to dive in on some real specifics around where SMRs are coming from in terms of the push we're getting for them right now. And for people online, people generally have some sense that Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which was a Crown corporation that received tens of billions of dollars in subsidies going back to the mid 50s, it was essentially privatized under the Harper government back in 2015. So we now have, by the way, 2 US companies, Fluor and Jacobs, as well as SNC-Lavalin. Yes, good old SNC-Lavalin is something called the Canadian National Energy Alliance and has control of Chalk River. But this relationship of these corporations isn't just a hypothetical link to military uses of nuclear. It's a direct link, because Fluor is a US company that operates the Savannah River site, which is a nuclear weapons facility in South Carolina under contract with the US Department of Energy. And they also have relations with the UK Atomic Energy UK Weapons Establishment. So we're looking at a quite direct relationship. So that if Canada goes with SMR designs, we'll be using uranium enriched to levels well beyond what we use in our current CANDU reactors. Others might use plutonium fuel. It definitely raises new and very serious weapons proliferation risks. And I don't think, this term small modular reactors makes people think that they're kind of benign. I think they're actually on the nuclear weapons proliferation side, even more distressing. And I will flag this for people on this call because we haven't had a lot of discussion in Canada. Why has Canada not signed the new United Nations Treaty for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons? It's coming into force January 22nd. We haven't signed, we haven't ratified. I think we really need to do that before we talk about nuclear.
So I've heard lots of cases for SMRs for 20 years. I think there is a plausible case that existing reactors were too large and that you might do better by mass producing something at a few hundred megawatts. To be clear, all the actual proposals from the sort of original logic from places like NuScale, the only company with a licensed one, was to put a lot of reactors in one place. They didn't have a single reactor with integrated heat. The costs of security and integration just kill you. I don't think nobody I know takes it very seriously. So Ed, you say that's the conversation in Canada. I don't know. I'm a Canadian. I care about energy. I don't think it's serious. The fact is the only serious effort to actually move forward and build the only licensed SMR is now in trouble. So that's the UAMP program at Idaho National Lab. I'm highly dubious. I think it could be that they end up getting smaller, but you're talking as if existing reactors are all at several gigawatts. They're not. Existing units are about a gigawatt. And there's no reason why, if you wanted to, say, decarbonize Western Canadian energy, you wouldn't build a few gigawatt units and then connect them up.
Gotcha.
How would you do that practically? Because I think that brings us back to this unavoidable discussion of sort of the politics of the Western Canadian electricity grid, right? And so, we can't even build right now a transmission line between BC and Alberta because of everything there. And so it's hard to see, it's hard to see how you could build it in Alberta within the competitive market. Maybe in BC, but then you still have those same challenges.
Totally agreed. I think in the near term, all this is a fantasy. In the near term, what we're doing is incrementally building in more renewables into the existing system. The question is, what do we do after that when we're really serious about decarbonizing the whole economy? So, as one questioner pointed out, Elizabeth, you were a little contradictory. You were saying you want the old model of transmission versus the new model. But I agree with you that pumped hydro can be really cost-effective way to do storage. I agree. And Canada, with all its hydro, could use hydro to manage intermittency in a serious way. But that demands much more long-distance transmission. It demands a big integrated grid.
It's a mix of both. I wouldn't say you did that for everything. We have this extraordinary little tiny example in Nelson, BC, of a solar utility based on people putting solar panels in backyards. And when you talk about the land footprint of solar, I'd have to say, look in urban areas and on the top, every school gym roof should have solar. That isn't building out and taking land away from nature. That's just saying we've got a lot of good space for solar that's in built infrastructure already. We can both, so I agree with you. The democratizing argument can still use a grid for storage and moving electricity. And also, Sarah, completely agree with you. We have got to get over the problem within Canada that it's easier. Why is it easier to sell renewable energy from Denmark to a separate nation state, Norway, than it is within Canada to get electricity from Alberta to BC? It's just craziness. And we have to have a sensible Federation of Canada decision that we need to be able to have a really strong national electricity grid that can wheel renewable energy from one province to the other and to territories.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to something that David said just around the seriousness of the conversation. I'd love to hear your critique. Then I really want to get to questions. So one Canadian application could be, and this is, building off the backs of strategic grid interties, look at Saskatchewan. And my understanding is Saskatchewan is seriously interested in an SMR, and an SMR that could go up 2 to 3, to go up to 300 megawatts in size. And that's their argument is, with a grid intertie, we can import hydro from Manitoba. When hydro is dicey in Manitoba, we can send power back to Manitoba. And at the same time, that's going to allow us to keep more gas off the grid as we build out renewables in Saskatchewan. So tell me the flaws in Saskatchewan's thinking there.
Me?
I don't think they're really thinking. It's the usual thing is that Saskatchewan is a uranium mining province. It has the nuclear industry has very strong ideological support within civil services, particularly in any place that's ever built a nuke. Outside places that have ever had any involvement with the nuclear industry, there's no interest in going there. So you get Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Ontario talking at at interprovincial meetings and pushing with the federal government that they want subsidies for this idea that they are proposing, which I think all of us agree on this panel, is more public relations than real, which is this notion that small modular reactors are somehow something different that Canadians will accept. Sorry, David, you were trying to jump in there.
No, I think I agree on that. I mean, I think we really have to distinguish, Ed, that the sort of near term, I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that Saskatchewan is like late phase negotiating a real contract to actually do something. I'm assuming some people are talking about it. Okay. And personally, as a Canadian physicist who cares about nuclear power, I had a searing experience where I served on the Bruneau Commission, where we had this very high level access on a range of energy technologies across Canada. And we went in to talk to senior people at ACL and CANDU, and this was with a staff to back us up. And I don't know how to say this politely, but I think it's fair to say that folks lied to us. It was really ugly. There was both deliberate, I mean, it was awful. And my reaction walking away from it as somebody who I think is fundamentally pro-nuclear in the long run would be that they just need to get rid of it. Like, cut it off, fire it, restart. It was awful. I mean, there were people tried to spin me on proliferation stuff. They basically, they were assuming we didn't know anything about nuclear power, and they told some stories about void coefficients that were just nonsense. And they also deliberately spun us about the budget in a way where we were able to go to our staff and see that they had, I think it's fair to say, lied. So my level of faith in the Canadian nuclear establishment is really low.
Okay.
But I think the question is more, Canada isn't in a vacuum. The question is, what happens if the world does have to decarbonize? We have a lot of places where we have high energy demands. We're not just talking electrical power. We're talking steel, cement, ammonia. How are we actually going to make that in the next 30 years in a low carbon world? And thinking through what the role of nuclear to me is serious, because even on this conversation, you've heard people just talk about things that look green. This green-brown thing, be careful. Hydro has big impacts.
Oh, yeah.
Wind has big impact. All these things have impacts that are real. And if we do them at scale, we cannot just pretend as environmentalists that these things are impact-free. They're not.
Yeah, maybe we'd all agree that, say, the Site C Dam is an environmental and a cultural archaeological disaster.
But it's a great dam in terms of watts per square meter.
Well, we have a little problem that it's wobbly on the geology. That's just a small point.
But sorry, I want to bring a questioner in, and one of the assumptions, or one of my first principles, is when we're talking about nuclear in Canada, we're actually not talking about a national strategy. We're talking about a series of regional ones. Because let's face it, there are provinces that just will never accept nuclear, have no interest. Manitoba, BC, Quebec. But then we do have places that are looking for different power sources to accommodate coal phase out and lessen the deployment of gas-fired electricity as replacement power. And I think of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and maritime provinces like New Brunswick. But let's bring in a questioner who's got a question.
Just say, by the way, Nova Scotia rejected nuclear quite a while back. So New Brunswick and Point Lepreau is an anomaly within the Maritimes. There was back in the day, Richard Hatfield tried to convince the other premiers to own Point Lepreau with him, and PEI and Nova Scotia rejected it.
Gotcha. Yep. So that I agree, and I tried to omit Nova Scotia there. But let's bring in AJ Gupta, who's got a question specific to Ontario. And of course, where's the base load of nuclear in the country? It's in Ontario. So AJ, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My question is for everyone. Ontario specifically has about 60% electricity production from nuclear. It's kind of an outlier in Canada. And how do you describe Ontario's investment in renewables since the price drop, given the grid mix and Mrs. May's comments? And should we talk about Ontario differently when it comes to nuclear in Canada? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to jump in?
I have one.
Well, just say I'll jump in quickly. Oh, sorry, you go first, Sarah.
Go Sarah, then Elizabeth. We'll go to you.
I mean, just quickly, sort of one plan I think we need to be thinking about seriously in Ontario as we think about refurbishments of existing plants and them being offline is using that as a chance to really bring on a lot more renewables, right? So, I mean, I think Ontario was a little bit scarred by its experience of being on an early phase of renewable deployment and seeing very high costs. And there is a risk of, what gets built while those nuclear plants are offline and not wanting to have sort of a dash to gas. So I think there is a pathway from here to there where you're basically building up a lot more of the renewables while you're doing the refurbishment. And then you're bringing actually those plants back online to meet an ever growing demand as we start to electrify more and more things. So I think there is, that's a very high level answer, but there are some interesting pathways to think about there that consider all of those elements.
Yeah. And I would say that the refurbishment should not be, we should not be willing to think that that's a good way to go. Talk about opportunity costs. Refurbishing old reactors, typically the record in Canada, way over budget and take longer to do. So Point Lepreau's refurbishment, the Public Utilities Commission for New Brunswick said, don't do it. You can't justify the cost. They did it anyway. And in terms of Ontario, AJ raises such a good point. There's much more potential for renewables if they hadn't gone the Dalton McGuinty route of let's do one deal with one provider and we'll go with that with minimal consultation with local communities. Again, if you're looking at democratizing energy and a mixed you really need a mixed portfolio. You want to do as much as you can with solar. You want to do as much as you can with wind. They never looked, for instance, in looking at doing anything into Lake Ontario at any distance, where you have really steady winds and near your biggest population areas. You have to do a lot with energy efficiency before you start feeding into a system that's leaking a lot of energy. So there's a lot of ways to look at renewables, and Ontario's first experience of it, it's hard to imagine how to have done it worse than they did it. It'd be great, by the way, of course, looking at places that have worked, where you have well, I won't keep going on about it because it's such a sad example of what Ontario did first, and it has tended to make people think renewables aren't as good a bargain for Ontario as they really are.
And I remember, just to jump in, I grew up in Ontario, and there was a time when people in Ontario weren't going to meter electricity because nuclear power would make it so cheap we wouldn't need to meter it. But looking at the chat board, one of the questions that's lighting up our board is, well, what do you do for baseload power? Because Ontario has made that strategic decision. That's going to be our baseload. And then we layer in intermittent sources on top of that. So Elizabeth, if not nuclear, then what for the baseload?
Well, as you're working on baseload, your baseload power, again, we've talked about pump storage. We're going to be, I think the one technology piece that I'm really excited about will be much more interesting work around batteries and how we store renewable energy. Then it becomes this peak load and base load thing, I think, has been oversold because we've taken out the notion that you can store your renewable energy. For now, and again, it's a for now, but for now and for the foreseeable, for the next couple of decades as we're decarbonizing, feeding into the grid, taking out of the grid operates in the same as being peak load and base load. It makes everything base load. Yep. It's available when you need it, and that's what you need to know. But building, as we know that the lifetime of those nukes, the reactors at Darlington and Pickering, they're going to be going down at Bruce. As they're going down, build up your renewable capacity, and build and do everything you can to improve the energy efficiency of your built infrastructure.
Great. David, if you can resist the temptation to jump in, I see you biting your lip. I promise to give you crack on the next question. I think you're going to like it. So this next question, it gets to oversight and regulation. I started by telling that story of the Chrétien government shenanigans to facilitate the sale of CANDUs to China without requiring an environmental assessment. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission maintains regulatory oversight, including impact assessments of new nuclear projects. And we lack a worldwide standard right now for approving and regulating. So we're doing it on a market by market basis. So that is a preamble. Our question coming from, and I'm sorry, I've missed the name of our questioner. Court Ashbaugh. What is the best way to ensure that the strongest and most disinterested technical experts have the greatest amount of control over government decision-making? So, David.
That would be a great question for any question we're looking at within government. Let's COVID vaccines, other climate, dispassionate experts. Okay, you go, David. You're a dispassionate expert.
Well, I'm not. So, that question is sort of. I think we need to reform the way democracies work. I don't think we should trust experts because experts become disassociated from the values that society has often. So, I mean, I guess I feel like this is such an off-topic comment. I don't sort of have an answer. I think Canada needs a better way to do high quality science advice into the parliamentary system. There's a bunch of deep reforms there. I don't have any simple answer. I do want to come back just to stick to this topic. I think it really is important to be realistic. We need to decarbonize on a scale of a couple decades. And the fact is, batteries for seasonal storage are so far away, we have no reason to believe they'll get there. They might get there, but we're talking an order of magnitude away, and we're not likely to invent new elements. And I think if you're you were absolutely right, Elizabeth, to talk about it, because whenever people talk batteries, whenever people talk storage, they think batteries, but in fact, pumped hydro is the dominant storage technology in the world right now, and people are still building a lot of it. But the idea that we're just going to get to solar and battery world, it might happen, but it's a technological fantasy for the future. And the point is, if you actually want to decarbonize now, there are places in the world we actually are completing nuclear builds in kind of 8 years. And we're doing it at prices under $5,000 a kW. That is in Asia, and those actually produce carbon-free, relatively safe power. And it's not perfect, but I think we have to think hard about why we don't want to do that. Those of us who are really serious about rapidly decarbonizing, and not just the electricity sector, but the whole economy.
Okay, Sarah, I know you want to get in on Kurt's question.
I love Core's question because it's like, to me, it's really key to this whole industrial policy that regular listeners will know I'm a big fan of. But I think it's really critical that government actually has that capacity, right? Has that expert capacity. And when we look, I think sometimes jealously at what the US is able to develop and commercialize in terms of new technologies, I think a lot of that, is due to where they come, the starting point of the strength of the national lab systems, things like DARPA, and to some extent ARPA-E, really having those experts that are within government and are able, or at least within the government institutions, and are able to produce their own technical research and to really drive the direction of technical research. And the gap between what we do in Canada, which is increasingly relying, especially for our R&D funding that's closer to industry, on industry participation, right? And so we're increasingly using things like matching funds from industry as a screen for projects that are worthwhile to move ahead with. And I think that's a real risk in terms of being able to separate the kind of hype from the real potential within those technologies, because you bring in that element of kind of who are the incumbents around the table that have the ability to pay. And so, David had this story about the nuclear industry lying. I think it's fair and important to say that it's not just that industry, all industries that are going to be lobbying for money and they all have an incentive to overrepresent the technologies that they have. And the only way that, you're really able to kind of combat that is to have that technical expertise that exists within government as well.
But I want to jump on what David said earlier too, because it's not just that the pro-nuclear folks are like the private sector fossil fuel lobby. They're deep state. They're deeply embedded in the bureaucracies of the provinces and the federal government departments that have promoted them. And that's the raison d'etre for some people in government, is just to get some more investments in nuclear. It's gotten a lot of money from the public purse historically. And I think that the starting comment would be, I couldn't agree more with what you said, David. The nuclear establishment in Canada is not trustworthy. So that means if that's your source of information for why it's a good idea to put money into small and medium reactors, then look who our private sector partner is. Talk about deep state interference of a private sector operator. I really want, and I know this is not the topic for today, but I want a public inquiry into SNC-Lavalin and how it got its hooks into the clerk of the Privy Council, such that the Prime Minister never got good legal advice about the Shawcross principle. Now, I know this is another issue, but SNC-Lavalin's ability to influence a government decision-making process on the subject of its own corruption worries me. And it's now the #1 private sector corporation interested in promoting small and medium reactors in this country.
Okay, I want to bring in another question from Judy Archer. And Judy, it's not just because I bumped into you on a walk around Canmore yesterday. This is no act of favoritism. And it's about the long lead time of nuclear technology. Her question, in the West, it takes roughly 5 to 10 years to approve and build a nuclear power plant. And yes, I can say from a little bit of research, I've heard the shortest we could get, say, an SMR online in Canada would be 6 years. Given that some forms of renewables, such as solar, can be approved and built in under a year and don't have the cost and time overrun history, not to mention the safety risks, why even bother with nuclear? So perhaps scope out costs, we've talked about that, but just talk about nuclear being a long lead time technology versus things that are far more quickly deployable.
Well, just that, by the way, we have to add into this that we're talking about a reactor. Small and medium reactors are not like something off the shelf that we are all used to how to build them. They are still quite more a technology on paper than in real life. So I think you have to add a couple of years to the 6-year prediction. We should be doing, and by the way, even faster than renewables is energy efficiency retrofits of buildings, thinking about reducing our costs of moving people around. We should be really investing in modernizing via rail. We should really be paying attention to public transit with inside cities and between. We're a vast geography where right now you're better off, if you're trying to catch a bus in a rural area, you're better off living in Mexico or the Dominican Republic than in Canada, where buses have disappeared. So these are just small examples of places where investments make tons of sense in reducing the fossil fuel component of those activities.
Yeah, and so to put it maybe Elizabeth, or opening up to Sarah and David. So if you think of solar, 10 years ago, solar was considered utility scale, long lead time technology, and it was expensive. And in those 10 years, you've said, Elizabeth, we've been able to dramatically bring the cost down. So now we can do utility scale solar in places like Alberta on a merchant basis without having to have a government-backed PPA. So should we not be making the same investments so we shorten that timeline and we decrease the cost?
The question is, can you, right? That happened in solar because we deployed thousands and then tens of thousands and then 100,000 modules, right? And so that's the challenge with SMR, is to come down that, learning curve in the same way through the number of projects. That's just, it's not going to happen because of the numbers there. It's not to say that they couldn't get cheap over time, but you're going to have to achieve it through a different.
Well, I mean, solar prices came down very, very dramatically because Germany decided to put a big bet on renewables and invested heavily in that. There's a whole Green Party history in how that happened. And then People's Republic of China stole the technology developed by Germany and then produced it way cheaper in China. So we've had we've had a phenomenal reduction in the cost of photovoltaic cells. And now Germany can't compete necessarily on the price per unit with what China can do. And although people quite rightly point out that for a lot of renewable technologies and batteries, we're looking at rare earth metals, but solar panels, you're looking at basically sand and aluminum, and you've got a really good product that produces electricity. And as your friend from your hike in Canmore, Judy says, you could do it really fast. But I don't want us to, in looking at the technologies that replace fossil fuels, like it behooves us to remember nothing's going to replace fossil fuels like what it did to human civilization. It was a one-shot jolt from millennia ago, and you're going to have to do a whole mix of everything you can get your hands on, starting with energy efficiency and solar and wind and geothermal and run-of-the-river hydro. We haven't, for Ontario, by the way, you look at some of the dams that are there that are really old, that just upgrade them, make them more efficient on existing run-of-the-river and more run-of-the-river. We have to look at absolutely everything we can grab.
Can I who knows? I love Elizabeth. Great to bring it into the kind of sweep of human history, because I think it is correct to say that fossil was this incredible transformation of human economic history and social history in all sorts of ways. My guess, I don't know, is that we actually won't do all these little things. That if you look at the energy system late this century, it'll be a couple things. And my guess is it'll be dominantly solar. And the big question is there a substantial nuclear component or not?
And we haven't talked about hydrogen. I'd love to know what you think about
hydrogen.
Hydrogen
Hydrogen is an
you have
energy
to go
carrier.
Back 5 episodes, Elizabeth.
Hydrogen is an energy carrier, not an energy source. So it has nothing to do with this discussion. So I think it's important to say that lots of these energy technologies people are throwing around really don't scale or only scale with big environmental impacts. I mean, wind power has, scaling it beyond sort of terawatt scale, it has really big environmental impacts. And I have not seen, the analysis I've seen of run-of-river hydro suggests it's relatively high impact energy source per unit power output. And people are sort of happy talk about how geothermal is going to be low. Each of those wells has relatively low productivity on energy basis, and they have environmental impacts both for servicing and because you've connected different reservoirs in the subsurface. So I think I really want to be cautious with the idea that we just do everything, including this tiny stuff, and that all its environmental impacts are low. What matters is an environmental impact on a per unit energy basis for things we can scale to really power the industrial civilization of this century without carbon.
And
Okay.
the next the post-carbon economy is going to have to look different. We have to reduce consumption rates. We have to actually pay attention to the finite nature of the biosphere, and we are living outside. We're acting as though we can continue to live outside the limits of the biosphere, and that's well, I guess the UN Secretary General said yesterday we have to stop having a war on nature. That, at a minimum, is what we have to do.
Here.
Okay.
Over to you, Ed.
Let's give that last word to our guest. Very well said, Elizabeth. I need to close up the conversation. It has flown by. Before I do that, a couple of things. One, I want to share the poll results. So from our conversation, which is ironic, given that we all agreed that we're not talking about taking nuclear offline, that existing nuclear will continue. All we've done is increase the vote of people saying nuclear will have no role in Canada's pathway to net zero. And then, by rounding errors, we've shifted around the votes in the large role or the small role. So there you go. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. A huge thank you, Elizabeth, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know how busy it is, because to get you and to fit into your parliamentary schedule to have that pre-chat, it was almost a heroic undertaking. A big shout out to Alexa as well for helping to carve out that time. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the work you do.
I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you and with the 150 or so participants who joined. And I know that you'll have many more people watching this afterwards as a taped conversation. People, just quickly to say, it's still on the Green Party website, broken out in a PDF, and how we do it, how it's called Mission Possible, getting to 60% below 2005 levels by 2030.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. And to add to what you're saying, yes, after the fact, you can watch this on YouTube. You can also listen to it as a podcast using any of your favorite podcatcher, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Hey, this is our last show of 2020. We'll be back in February 2021 with what we're calling season 2 of Energy versus Climate, with a whole new slate of topics and guests. In January, we're going to have a podcast-only Q&A episode. Just like today's episode, there's a slew of questions that regretfully we weren't able to get to. We'll be tallying some from past shows, and we'll just have a Q&A episode, which will be available sometime in January. And if you have questions you want to submit, feel free to submit them to energyversusclimate@gmail.com, energyvsclimate@gmail.com. Thanks to our very patient producer, as always, Eva Voinigescu, and to Mika McFarlane for his day of support. We will see you again in 2021. Have a great end to an eventful year, everyone, and stay safe and rest up.